On September 16, 2023, Percival Parks families gathered at Tulalip's Greg Williams Court to learn about their ancestry. Les Parks hosted the reunion, sharing 10 years of research family history spanning 7 generations to help today's youth and future leaders know who they are and where they come from.
All right, so some of you know I've been working on a book, a family history book, a Percival book for about 10 years. And I'm about 20% complete. And over through the years, I've just done so much research and back and forth. I've been down to Seattle, down to the archives down there, and just studying up, trying to gather as much information as I can. And I just couldn't get back to writing in the book. But in my heart, I know how important it is for me to finish that book, not for me, but for you, for the young kids, for my grandkids, for my great-grandkids that are growing up. It's important for all of us to know who we are and where we came from. And so this presentation, we all hear about the term 7 generations. We always look forward 7 generations. And what does looking forward 7 generations really mean? I don't know if anybody's really sat down and thought about what 7 generations is. I've dug back as far as I can in the Indian history, and as you all know, our relatives way back then didn't write stuff down. It was all oral history, so there is very, very little of our Indians way back before the settlers arrived here. But I was able to go back and find my 7th generation looking back. His name was Gugwalkablu. His white man's given name was Tom Skagush. But Gugwalkablu, he was born in about 1815, a long time ago. And if he happened to be looking forward 7 generations, this is what he would have seen. He would have seen his firstborn and only son, James Percival. Let that ring a bell in your minds, James Percival. We all hear about some of the Percivals. You haven't heard much about James Percival, his son. James Percival went on to have several kids. One of those kids was Ed Percival, and we've all heard Ed Percival's name. Ed Percival went on to have several kids, and one of those was Grandma Evie, she was born Julia Edith Parks. She was born Julie, and I'll show that to you on the record here in a little bit. And then, of course, my dad, Glenn Parks, and then I would be the 5th generation of Gugwalkablu. My kids would be the 6th generation, and my grandkids would be the 7th generation. So when we talk 7 generations, this is how far back you have to go and how far forward Gugwalkablu would have looked forward 7 generations, over 200 years ago. So here's Gugwalkablu's firstborn son, James Percival, born in 1853. Ed Percival, his son, born in 1873. Grandma Evie, born in 1902, by some accounts 1901, and if you talk to some others, 1903, but I have shown, I've researched, and 1902 is the year that I have Grandma Evie being born. And that's a young Grandma Evie. Phyllis Parks, Aunt Philly. This is our Canadian side. Aunt Noni. And then, of course, Glenn Parks. So Gugwalkablu, born in 1815, was a full-blood Snoqualmie Indian, and that's where we get our roots. This says he was living in one of these 16 longhouses up in the Fall City, Carnation area. There were at one time about 16 longhouses up there. And one of the great tribal leaders of Snoqualmie, and you may have heard his name before, is Pat Canham. So Pat Canham and Gugwal were born about the same year, and they grew up together as lifelong friends. So Gugwal and Pat Canham. And then Snoqualmie, of course, was a very, very powerful tribe back in those days because they held the key to the east side of the mountains. Tribes would want to go east, and the eastern tribes would want to come west. And in order to do so, you had to travel through Snoqualmie country. And Snoqualmie chiefs and their sub-chiefs demanded gifts. If you were the Lummies or the Snohomish or other tribes from the east were traveling, they would gift the chiefs of the Snoqualmie tribe, and consequently, Snoqualmie was one of the most powerful Indian tribes on Puget Sound, led by one of the chiefs, Pat Canham. In 1825, Pat Canham and Gugwal are just little 10-year-old boys. In 1825, they were on a clam dig, a tribal clam dig over at Camano Island and over at Hat Island. And in the middle of the night, the group that was camped at Camano Island had a landslide, and the landslide came down right on top of our ancestors. And they're still buried there today in that landslide on Camano Island. That Camano Island has such cultural significance to us because our ancestors are still there. That little well, it was a huge landslide. The whole tip of the island went into the water, caused a little tsunami that went over to Hat Island, and the Snoqualmies that were camped on Hat Island, many of them were swept into the water and perished. We lost everybody at Camano and about half the people at Hat Island. Pat Canham and Gugwal did live through that incident of losing so many of our Snoqualmie people. They went out and even at 10 years old, they were out in the water helping save the ones that they could. And then, of course, in 1855, the Point Elliott Treaty was signed over at Mukilteo, and Pat Canham was one of the 4 head chiefs of the entire group of Indians over at Mukilteo that sat in front. There were 4 chiefs in front. Pat Canham was one of them. Gugwal was behind him. Gugwal his only son, his one and only son, James, was born in 1853, 2 years before the treaty was signed. And James's mother did not survive childbirth, so James was raised without a mother. In 1855, after the treaty was signed, a gentleman by the name of Eugene Casimir Charouse, Father Charouse, came to Tulalip, and he set up on the reservation here, and right down below the red church, he set up the very first little school there in 1857. Little James Percival was only 4 years old at that time, hadn't gone to school yet. His dad, Gugwal left James with Father Charouse for Father Charouse to kind of raise him along with the rest of the Indians in the community. And consequently, after the treaty was signed, of all the thousands of Indians living on Puget Sound and that were the ones that were supposed to come to Tulalip, only 400 Indians ever came to Tulalip, about 450 or so. Most Indians stayed out in the wilderness in their ancestral grounds where they, where they could hunt and gather and do the things that they grew up doing. So at the end of the day, there was a very small group that ended up coming here to Tulalip. But of that 450 that came to Tulalip, everybody in this room can be tied back to one of those 450 that came to Tulalip, and they ultimately became Tulalip tribal members. In 1862, so we just went through a pandemic. in 2020. In 1862, there was a bit of a pandemic, but it wasn't a sickness that just kind of floated around. It was a sickness that the white man brought to the Indians. So the white man laced Indian blankets with the smallpox virus in order to eradicate the Indians. And Indians up and down the West Coast into Canada, entire tribes were lost as a result of that smallpox epidemic of 1862. But Father Charus, being the good man that he was, recognized what was going on, and he vaccinated every one of the 450 Indians living at Tulalip. And consequently, only 3 people from the Tulalip reservation at that time died as a result of the smallpox epidemic. But that's just an example of how the white men were trying to eradicate us at the time. So in 1857, Father Charus builds this little school down by the Red Church, and he stayed there for a couple of years with only about 15 little Indian boys, no girls in the school yet. In I think it was about 1859, they outgrew that little tiny school by the Red Church, and they moved that school up to the Priest Point area where today's Priest Point Cemetery is. And that became Tulalip's second Indian school. And as things went back then, when an Indian died or one of the students of Father Charus died, they would take him right outside the school and bury him in the ground there. And that's where Priest Point Cemetery got its start, was from Father Charus. And Priest Point got its name actually from Father Charus, being the priest at the time, Priest Point. Where Father Charus's school was, by the Red Church, actually became the Percival allotment. James Percival was allotted that land in 1884, somewhere in there during the General Allotment Act. And so the land that Father Charus built his first school on is right where our Percival allotment is. And then the old house, of course, was on that, in that allotment, right on the corner of the allotment. And when I talk about the old house, you have to be old like me to know what I'm talking about. Okay, so there's the first school, there's the second school, and then in 1862, the year of the smallpox pandemic, Father Charus moved it to Mission Beach. And Mission Beach got its name from the missionary Father Charus. So Mission Beach. And that's how the Priest Point Cemetery got its start. So I want to get on with the first generation, which would be Gugwal Kablu's son. Born 1853. Would have went to Father Charus's school, so he was somewhat of an educated Indian. Was 9 years old at the pandemic. James met his wife. His wife's name is Susan, so Susan would be my great-great-great-grandma. Susan was also Snoqualmie Indian, so Snoqualmie and Snoqualmie, husband, wife, they have kids, and that's where we get our Snoqualmie roots from, is from James Percival, Gugwal Kablu's dad, or son. So James and Susan would go on to have several kids. Their first child was Ed Percival, born in 1873. Ed's brother, Robert, born in 1877. Ed's sister, Susie, born in 1885. James Jr., born in 1890. Moses, born in 1895. And then had a sister, Maddie, born in also 1895. And what's odd about this is James and Susan had 5 kids other than Ed. Ed, Robert, Susan, James, Moses, and Maddie. 5 kids. All of a sudden in 1900, those kids disappear, and there is absolutely nothing on the record on what happened to them. James Percival's kids, James and Susan, Ed's brothers and sisters, are just gone. And I can only presume that they were lost in some kind of tragic accident, a house fire or something. Back in those days, we relied on the Marysville Globe for our written history. And it just turns out that the Marysville Globe also had a fire, and they lost all those records during those years. So we have absolutely no records of what happened to Ed Percival's brothers and sisters. And then suddenly in 1900, 5 new kids show up in James and Susan's household. And the Tulalip community adopted these 5 new members as Ed's brothers and sisters, but they weren't really his brothers and sisters, they were his cousins. And I can only ascertain from the record that James's brother, who lived out in the ancestral grounds, lost his life, and so the kids of his brother came to Tulalip and lived with James and Susan. And so those kids that all of a sudden show up as Ed's new brothers and sisters in 1900 are Wesley Percival, Guy Percival, Emily Percival, Benjamin Percival, and Andrew Percival. Guy and Emily Percival, his half brothers and sisters, I guess, would be the only 2 that would survive into a long life. And in fact, Emily would grow up and she would marry a couple of different times, and then Emily would ultimately marry Fingal Beck. And I'm looking at Billy and some of the elders. You guys will remember Fingal Beck. He lived up by the Red Church. Teresa remembers Fingal. So Grandma Evie's aunt, so this would be her aunt, Aunt Emily, marries Fingal Beck. And Emily ended up, because of coming into the Percival home, when James and Susan passed, Emily ended up getting the Percival allotment where the Red Church is. She became the owner of that allotment. And then tragically, James, who is now 53 years old, is at the mouth of the Quilceda River, the Quilceda Creek. The Percival allotment is right there, and that's where he lived. He's out fishing and he drowns right at the mouth of the Quilceda Creek. So we lost James Percival. And there's the article that was in the Marysville Globe in 1903 about James Percival being found at the mouth of the Quilceda Creek River. And there is the death certificate for James Percival. And there's only one written record of James's dad, Gugwal Kablu. But right here it lists James's father, Gugwal Kablu. And that's the only Indian name that I've ever seen on the record. I know some of our Canadian cousins have done some research for James's dad. The only way we know it's Gugwal Kablu is what was on this death certificate. All right, so James is now gone, and I'm going to move on to Ed Percival, which would be the 2nd generation of Gugwal Kablu, born in 1873. And Ed, by Indian standards of those days, was a very highly educated man, because James had Ed growing up in the Father Teresa's school system, which eventually was handed over to the Sisters of Charity. And so Ed, if you look at his handwriting and some of the writings that he did, you can just tell that he was a highly educated man. He knew his stuff, and he was very, very active in our Tulalip community here at Tulalip. Ed would go on, and at 24 years old, Ed would marry his wife. Now, Ed had 5 wives in his lifetime. His first wife and Grandma Evie's mother, Philomena. Philomena was born here at Tulalip. Her dad, Philomena's dad, was Henry Celestine. Henry Celestine was a full-blood Lummi Indian. And her mom, Philomena's mom, was Cecilia George. She was a full-blooded Snohomish Indian. So we got roots in all over Puget Sound in who we are. Primarily Snoqualmie, but we've got Snohomish, we've got Lummi, we've got, we're part everybody. Philomena and Ed were married in 1897 because her parents were Lummi. They were married up in what was back then called New Whatcom County, which is basically Lummi. 1897 is the same year they were married. They had their first little boy, Grandma Eby's oldest brother, Francis. They had their second child, Henry, born in 1898, but he passed in 1899, and there's the death certificate for Henry. This would be Grandma Eby's second oldest brother. Their third child was born in 1900, William. William would live for quite a few years, up to the age of 20, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then Grandma Eby was born in 1902. And if you talk to my cousin Debbie, she says 1903, because that's what Grandma told her. But I can go back on the record and I can show you 1902 where she was actually born. And then in 1903, Grandma Eby had a little sister. Again, no name, that's the one that passed. And then in 1905, Grandma Eby's just a little girl. Her brother Francis suddenly dies. No explanation as to what happened to him. Her brother Francis dies. So here's Grandma Eby's siblings. Brother Francis, now gone. Brother Henry, now gone. Brother William, he lives to the age of 20. And then the little girl, sister, unknown. And then as a result of Ed's 4 other wives, Grandma Eby had half brothers and sisters. Little Charles, and I'll talk a little bit about the other wives of Ed's here in a minute. The other, Charles was born in 1914 to one of his wives. Wheeler, born in 1916 to another different wife. And then a half-brother born in 1918, only lived 2.5 weeks. And then half-sister, Grandma Eby's half-sister, Stella Percival. Grandma Eby's mom passed at a young, Grandma Eby's very young age of 4 years old. Philomena passed in 1906, and Ed was now left to raise the kids all on his own. Here's an article in the Marysville Globe, 1906, of Philomena's passing. And I don't know what happened to Philomena. I just know that in 1906, Grandma Eby lost her mom. In 1908, Ed's now raising, Grandma Eby and William, and he marries his second wife, Ella, because she didn't live very long after they were married. Ed and Ella passes, married until 1912, and then she's gone. Ed's still raising Grandma Eby and William in the home. And then after Ella, in 1913, only a year after his second wife dies, he marries his third wife, Lena Buck. And again, she marries Ed, becomes Lena Percival. Lena and Ed have Grandma Eby's half-brother, Charles. And then a year later, Lena passes. So now here's Ed raising Grandma Eby and William, and now little Charles in the home. Ed all by himself here at Tulalip. On December 14th, 1915, Ed marries his fourth wife, Maddie Celestine. And Maddie Celestine was actually married to Philomena's brother. So Maddie was Philomena's brother-in-law. So Ed marries his sister-in-law, basically, is what happened. And so Ed marries Maddie in 1915. And in my heart of hearts, he married Maddie because that was as close to his first love, Philomena, as he was going to get, was Maddie. Maddie was close to Philomena growing up, and when he lost Philomena, he ended up marrying Maddie. And here is their marriage certificate in 1915. So they're raising the kids, and then Maddie and Ed have a little boy, Wheeler, in 1916. Little boy. So now Grandma Evie's got another half brother, Wheeler, and then Ed and Maddie have another baby, born in 1918. But that baby only survives 2.5 weeks. And so, as I mentioned, we all went through a pandemic in 2020. In 1918, the entire world was going through a pandemic again. It was called the Spanish flu pandemic. And the Spanish flu, no one was exempt from Spanish flu, and it came here to Tulalip. The flu hit Ed's home. The little baby only lives 2.5 weeks because of the Spanish flu. Little Charles and little Wheeler both die on the same day from the Spanish flu. Ed goes into Marysville to make funeral arrangements for the two little boys. He comes back home and Maddie is dead from the Spanish flu. He lost nearly his entire family in the span of a couple of days to the Spanish flu. Grandma Evie and William, Grandma Evie, still in school. She went to the boarding school, and William, also the boarding school. They survived the Spanish flu, didn't have any big issues to deal with, but Ed lost Maddie, Wheeler, the other little brother. Tragic. And so here is an article in 1918, Ed Percival has been sorely afflicted. His infant son died November 21st, and then on December 9th, his two sons die, and then his wife Maddie dies. Terrible. And Grandma Evie, of course, was at the Tulalip boarding school until 1919. Again, a very highly educated woman, following in her dad Ed's footsteps. And in 1921, William, her brother, her full-blood brother, was playing football, was tackled, was injured, and died from his injuries. So she lost her brother in 1921. And there's an article about William passing. And then after Maddie passed, Ed began dating another woman, which would become his fifth and final wife, Ellen Warbus. Ellen Warbus was married to George Warbus, and Ellen was a full-blood Lummi Indian, as was George. So Ed marries another Lummi Indian, Ellen. And there's the marriage certificate in 1921 for Ed and Ellen. And just so happened, Grandma Evie and her husband, Glenn Parks Sr., our grandpa, was married just a few months later. In April of 1922, Grandma Evie and Glenn Parks Sr. get married, right after Ed and Ellen get married. And as I mentioned, Ed was a very educated man, and he was very instrumental in everything that happened here at Tulalip. He was a powerful man in his day, a powerful leader, and he was one that helped start what was called back then the Northwest Federation of American Indians. Northwest Federation of American Indians went on to become today's Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. Ed Percival was instrumental in making that group happen and bringing all the Indians together. He was a great leader in Indian country, and up and down the I-5 corridor, he was traveling all the time, back and forth, Seattle, Lummi, back and forth as part of the Federation. Just a great leader in his day, as Grandma Evie would become. So Ed and Ellen, they'd separate for a brief time. During one of Ed's journeys on the Federation, his fifth wife had an affair. He comes back, she's pregnant, and that's how little Stella Percival was born, through an illegitimate affair. Sarah Stella Percival would grow up, and she would marry a guy you might know as Filipino. Mom, Lee Parks' dad, Filipino. would marry Sarah Stella Percival. And Ed and Ellen they would remain together for quite a few years until 1937, when Ed finally passes. You know, he'd lived a long life, helped establish Tulalip as who they were and what we had become. Ed had lived through the creation of the tribe's constitution and bylaws, as did Grandma Eby. And so I want to get on and talk about Grandma Eby. So of course, born in 1982, passed in 1982. Here's the 1902 census that I talked about. And you can't see it on here, but in the little dark area right here is Ed Percival, Philomena Percival, and then the two boys, and Grandma Eby right there, 6 months old in 1902. That's the very first census that Grandma Eby's name shows up. So she was born in 1902. Could have been 1901, actually, but 1902. And here's the 1903 census, when Grandma Eby was just 1 year old. She wasn't born Edith Parks, she was born Julie Percival. Julie Edith Percival. So Julie was her first name. It wasn't until 1908 that Grandma started calling herself, when she was 7, 8 years old, I think, started calling herself Eby. Changed her name from Julie to Edith. Now all of a sudden, Julie has become Julia Edith. And then in the school records, you'll see her now showing up as Edith, just drops the Julia name altogether. And Grandma Eby, of course, grew up in the school system and in the boarding school. When the federal government took over the Sisters of Charity's school back in 1902, the federal government immediately started ruling the boarding school like a military type school. And we've all heard the horror stories of the boarding school, but that's where Grandma Eby was raised, in that boarding school era. And the federal government finally got wise after several years that their style, military style, wasn't working, and so they kind of changed up their style. Never really was good, but it was really, really bad in the early years. Yep, and Grandma Eby endured all of that through the boarding school years. Grandma Eby and Grandpa Glenn would have their first baby right after they were married in April 1922. They would have little Thelma Parks, born in 1922. And here's an article. Grandma Eby lost her firstborn child, Thelma, in a car accident in Marysville when Thelma was only 7 years old. 7 years old. And then on December 16th, 1924, Grandma Eby has her second child, Phyllis Parks. 1927, third child, Aunt Noni. Fourth child, 1930, Glenn Parks. Here's two articles from the Marysville Globe that talk about Grandma Eby and Grandpa Glenn as having lost a child on December 7th, 1923, and another time in 1925. So I can find no other records showing that Grandma Eby lost these two children than what was in the Marysville Globe. But apparently Grandma had other children that didn't make it. And Grandma Eby, being highly educated, just like Ed, both were very involved in tribal affairs. Grandma Eby assisted with the Federation of American Indians. She also assisted in 1930, Tulalip decided it was time to start forming a tribal leadership group. And in 1930, they formed a group. I would call it the ad hoc board, because the regular board of directors weren't elected until 1935. But they did actually have a group of leaders that started in 1930, and I have the minutes from those 1930 to 1935 meetings. And Grandma Eby was one of the ones that was taking all the notes. She was kind of like the secretary, taking those notes between 1930 and 1935. And this ad hoc board is the one that was presented, that had presented our Tulalip membership with adopting the Constitution and bylaws. And the ad hoc board actually introduced the bylaws, Constitution to the membership twice, and the membership voted it down the first 2 times. The third time, it was finally adopted in 1935 by a vote of 98 for and 9 against. See, so the very first members of the board were elected in 1936. Constitution adopted in 35, members elected in 1936. One of those members elected decided to resign, and Grandma Eby put her name in on the board of directors in 1937 and was elected as the very first woman of the Tulalip Tribe's board of directors in 1937. So in 1930, here's some of the transcribed minutes from those meetings I was telling you about from the ad hoc board. And what it says here is they decided before the Constitution that they nominated Wilfred Steve as their chairman. And then they also nominated William Shelton, Alex Young, Sebastian Williams, and then Hubert Coy. So that was our very first ad hoc board of directors. And then when we started reviewing the Constitution and bylaws, they decided they needed 6 more members to serve alongside those 5. And Grandma Eby was one of those 6 members that helped write the Constitution that was finally adopted in 1935. She served on 2 tribal councils, and that's Grandma Eby right there. And look at this guy right here, Big Shot. Big Shot was, at that time, in 1948, was the vice president of the Snoqualmie tribe. Our Big Shot was the vice president. I had a hard time believing that, but the picture proved it. And Grandma Eby also served on that council. And here's just a little article about Grandma Eby helping with the 4-H club. She was just actively involved all over the place. But this is our Aunt Philly, your guys' mom, Phyllis Parks. This is her wedding when she married, there's Aunt Philly, married Frank Madison. And there is Aunt Noni right there in the full regalia. And now, of course, we'll get on to Grandma Eby's kids. And I'm gonna be covering my side because I'm the speaker, so I get to talk about Dad. And just real quickly, so here's Dad's high school graduation picture, and I always remember this through the years because that reminded me of Dad so much. The stillest waters run the deepest, and that all to me always told me who my dad was. The stillest, the quietest guy is always the deepest guy, and that was him. And then here's in auto shop in high school, and here's Dad's high school baseball picture, and they played a lot of baseball back in those days. Dad was the first baseman for the high school team. Oh, there's Dad. That's Herman Williams Sr., and that's Ray Sheldon. Their high school picture, they all served on the same baseball team. And here's another Indian baseball league. And there's Dad right there. Mel Sheldon Sr. I recognize, and I'm sure you guys, some of you probably recognize the others in this picture. This was kind of a funny little deal. Dad back in, when he was 15 years old, him and Uncle George Taylor were out hunting ducks, and Dad was walking behind Uncle George with his shotgun and accidentally shot Uncle George in the butt. And here's an article that talked about it. Of course, my mom, who died in 1966, and then my brother Rocky's high school picture. More baseball. And then Dad Lee, here's your marriage certificate. I found it on the record. Married July 25th, 1970. So going back a long ways, 1970. All right, that's it. I could go on and talk about more and more and more, but I know you guys probably don't want to keep hearing from me. But to me, it's just, I'm hoping what I've done here draws out other families in the Tulalip tribes, not just the Parks Percival family, but I want other families to go back and dig back into their history so they can teach their kids where they came from, the back 7 generations. And through each and every generation from Gugual every new generation coming up, we lose a little bit more of who we are as Indians. Our Indian identity is lost with each generation as they grow up. But we're changing that. This generation of today, the young generation coming up and the ones that are teenagers now are changing that. We're getting back to our roots, and they are becoming such strong Indian leaders in our community, and they are going to be the future leaders of Tulalip. And I want them to understand where they came from and who they are. And losing that Indian identity is starting to reverse itself, where we're gaining more and more Indian identity because of things like this that we're doing today. And I'm one guy from this family that brought out the history, but this is all about you. It's all about our family. It's all about the kids. It's all about the youth and our future leaders. So I just never want anybody to ever forget who they are and where they came from and what our Parks Percival side means to this Tulalip tribes and its very early humble beginnings. And Gugual 7 generations ago, what he did for us. So, thank you.